Ilya Ehrenberg's The Life of the Automobile is a strange but compelling book that has never been given any extended consideration, either as a literary novel or as a cultural history in Anglophone literary studies. It's a footnote in Ehrenberg's life, a life that spans the European avant-garde and Stalinism. As well as a novelist, he was both a European cultural figure who was friends with Picasso amongst others, and a Soviet propagandist in the Second World War. The work is also a footnote in contemporary histories of automobility, and if you look at something like Autophobia by Ladd and Speed by Duffy for just two examples, but never more than a footnote. Given its range and engagement with many of the key themes of current and past automobility and mobility studies, and in particular the cultural and material implications of the production and consumption of the automobile, this is surprising and probably only partly explained by the negative reaction to Ehrenberg's work as a propagandist during the Second World War and afterwards. The book resists genre categorization and sits between history and fiction. Ehrenberg acknowledges this shifting between genres when he says in an author's note written in Paris and dated 1929, "This book is not a novel, it is a chronicle of our time. The heroes are not imaginary, the story was not invented by an author." End of quote. He does, however, he says, offer his own explanations for the actions of his characters and replace names with fictitious ones for people whose lives can in no way be regarded as public. The book also contains a glossary that gives brief biographies of some of the main figures, sustaining an uneasy relationship between history and fiction. In other places he admits to rearranging certain details. In others he makes a point of not deviating from the raw material, from news items, minutes of meetings, court records, memoirs, diaries and private letters. That he was living in Paris at the time and friends with Picasso during the development of Cubism is not coincidental. And in a much later interview in the Paris Review in 1961, he reveals a continued lively engagement with novel form. I quote at length. "It seems to me," he says, "that the novel is very much alive as a form. Without any question, every epoch has its own forms, and the novel nowadays cannot resemble that of the 19th century. In this domain, all experiments are justified. It's better to write something new, clumsily, rather than repeat the old, brilliantly. In the 19th century, novels dealt with the fate of a person or a family. This was linked to life in that period. In our time, the destinies of people are interwoven. Whether man recognizes it or not, his fate is much more linked to that of many other people than it used to be. This modifies the architecture of the novel. Some of my novels are conceived as chronicles of our times, but humanized chronicles, unlike chronicles by historians or sociologists." End of quote. This modifies his stark warning at the beginning of The Life of the Automobile that this is not a novel, and rather enables us to read it more as a humanized chronicle, self-consciously authored history in conversation with a novel form, in a state of constant experimentation as it develops in relation to the times that provide its context. If, as Ricoeur asserts in his 3-volume Narrative and Time, narrative humanizes time, then Ehrenberg is drawing on the form of the novel and its techniques of narrative to present and represent history at a human scale. While The Life of the Automobile might lack an overall plot, it does not lack plots, characters, locations or narrative, but has many of them. The work might have received little attention in Anglophone cultures, but this was not the case in other countries in Northern Europe. It was, as two recent essays by Hans Anton and Ralph Gruttermeyer point out, an important text in the New Objectivity movement that originated in Germany in the 1920s and was also influential in Dutch literature. The Life of the Automobile was, in Dutch literature anyway, seen as a prime example of new objectivity. First translated into German in 1930, almost immediately after its Russian publication and a long time before its translation into English, Arten reports it as being received with great enthusiasm. The reviewers interestingly variously describe the work as a novel, as a pamphlet, or as a flyer, those latter terms giving it the sense of urgency as something rapidly produced and widely distributed. They also connect it with journalism, and a part of the agenda of literary new objectivity is, in the words of Anten, to renew prose by asserting the validity of journalism as a literary genre, and the process whereby, I quote, the dynamic world of technology and industry is given form in a variety of scenes whose unifying principle is contrast and simultaneity. It is described as an industrial and documentary form that uses, I quote again, endless facts and numbers, the present continuous tense, short sentences and simple syntax, as well as one that uses fragmented structures that can be related to the technique of cinematic montage in the work of Russian avant-garde filmmakers. Anton mentions both John Dos Passos' Manhattan and Alfred Doblin's Berliner Alexanderplatz as examples of new objectivity literature, but it's apparent that some of the ideas crossed the Atlantic in the other direction, or there were simultaneous realizations. Muriel Rukeyser, for example, in the Book of the Dead, follows many of the precepts of new objectivity, as does William Carlos Williams in Patterson and Charles Reznikoff, particularly in Testimony. So the Life of the Automobile narrates the experiences of many individual characters without ever resolving them into a conventional narrative form. If there is a notion of singularity that arises from this multiplicity, it can only be the automobile of the title, which is both a social good and a destructive force in human history. The first chapter, entitled The Birth of the Automobile, is divided into 4 numbered sections. It begins with the story of Charles Bernard, seduced into buying a motor car by the modern media of film and then by the radio. The consequence of his developing love affair with the car is that he neglects reading his Almanac of Nature Lovers, previously his favourite pastime, and replaces it with a guidebook, maps and a compass. He's lured away from the rhythms of the natural world by the dynamism of technology. He switches from an observance of times, seasons and calendars, past histories and future predictions that he could monitor on his regular trips to the local botanical garden, to a study of the space between him and his sister, who he wanted to visit, a space previously described as a train journey of 12 hours. He buys a car and sets off, gradually driving faster, before a crash we presume to be fatal that ironically reduces the speeding motor car to something unstirring. The collision between the natural and technological is complete when the car crashes into a dale filled with dry juniper, in which, I quote, linnets warbled, birds we were previously told Bernard had never heard in his urban experiences of nature. The second part of the chapter relates the story of Philippe Le Bon, inventor of the first internal combustion engine. Le Bon's aim is to liberate people from work, in this case through the invention of a self-propelled carriage. This will be for Le Bon the real meaning of revolution, a liberation over time and space that is a common good, and in which travel from Paris to Rome is available, I quote, at the flick of a wrist. Le Bon's story ends with the registration of a patent for an internal combustion engine in 1799, 90 years before the appearance on the streets of Paris. The third section of the opening chapter, I won't go through all of it in this level of detail, I just want to give you an idea of how it works by using one chapter example. The third section of the opening chapter places a motor car in turn-of-century Paris through a collage of voices and reportage that reference contemporary changes in art, with reference to Cézanne in poetry, in the work of Mallarmé in song, and the development of new dance steps such as the automobile polka. The production of the motor car is therefore linked to and part of the production of other aesthetic forms. The fourth section of the first chapter again begins with a brief anecdote about the early car racer Barney Oldfield, who won his first race in a car made by Henry Ford, a victory that Ford went on to use to persuade financiers that they should support him, and that the future lay in oil, not electricity. And the pitch to the financiers became an opportunity for Ehrenberg to describe Ford's vision of the ways that the automobile and its production and consumption is not only part of the development of capitalism in the USA, but is its epitome. It not only changes relationships to time and space, but between the worker and their work, producing a moral and sober workforce who will themselves own Ford automobiles. So the construction of this chapter, the shift between the voices of the producers and consumers, those who lived and died by the automobile and its manufacture, between anonymous citizens and historical figures, and real and imagined events, provides a structure for the book as a whole. It is a structure that permits Ehrenberg to describe the ways that the lives of individuals are part of larger historical moments, the ways that the arbitrary and risky decisions of the venture capitalists and entrepreneurs affect those individuals. The second chapter, the conveyor belt, for example, follows a similar but no less compelling format, moving from a generalized description of the assembly line method of production for which workers have to be transformed and accommodated to each type of machine and, I quote, stop thinking, to a character-driven piece of realist fiction about the impact on the lives of individuals and their family. So the final chapter of the book is fittingly called Roads, the place where the car sets out for future and distant places. The taxi driver, Carl Lang, has been forced to leave the sea and the family occupation of fishing, work that is carried out within the rhythms of the ocean for the work of driving a taxi. His father's knowledge of the sea meant that, I quote, he knew when the fish were coming, he knew when a storm was brewing, he knew the tints of the water, and he knew about death. He had blue nets with small meshes, and he had a big family, but he was happy. End of quote. This has been replaced for his son by a life behind the wheel in a car whose, I quote, engine consisted of hundreds of parts in a city that consisted of hundreds of streets and where time is measured by the ticking of the meter. Like the workers on the production line, but unlike his father, he has no time to think. Roads might be seductive in promising freedom, but become another form of servitude for those who have to work on them. And the flexibilities of time and space are for the passengers, not the workers. In such ways, throughout this book, the bodies of workers are torn apart by the industrial processes of the automobile industry and the consequences of its products. Yet the damage is not restricted to the working class, but also destroys the ethics and morals of all classes, constructing a culture and a society that is fatally damaged. No one voice can represent this, and Ehrenberg uses form and diction to construct his book out of the many voices that are affected by the automobile and its industry. For him, quite explicitly, the automobile and the oil industry produce and are produced by new forms of narrative and the novel. Thank you.